Hey Kings, and welcome back to the Augustus Maximus channel and the world of Hearts of Iron 4. Back playing the Together for Victory Overhaul mod and playing as Australia. And today we'll be playing as Independent Australia. Now what does Independent Australia entail? Well, it entails, instead of having the British as our overlord, an actual overlord, you know, because we are currently a puppet, it entails becoming a sort of a figurative underling of the United States, because we are going to create a faction with the United States very early on, just to get the research bonuses, obviously. But very quickly what you realize is that because the game has changed in such a dramatic fashion, and now other people can actually just overtake the leadership of the faction, we're essentially creating a faction, and then the United States is going to become the leader of a faction, and that's basically how it's going to be. But what this whole spiel entails is essentially, yeah, we're going to go independent and join the United States, which means that effectively we're still going to be in a faction with the Allies, sort of, kind of. We're going to be fighting in the same side. But we won't be joining the war as early, and we definitely won't be going against the Germans, no. Essentially, what this whole campaign and this whole strategy and this whole run is gonna center around is, well, fighting the Japanese, obviously, because we're in the Pacific. We're sort of the first line of defense, well, almost the first line of defense against the Japanese, or at least one of the major factions that's not China fighting against the Japanese. And obviously, whenever they attack the United States, we're gonna get pulled into a war, or we're gonna obviously agree to get into the war, and we're gonna fight against the Japanese. And that's the entire strategy. That is the entire game plan here. We're only focusing on the Japanese, and because we are sort of a minor faction. We are not a faction, a minor country, obviously, a minor, well, power, so to say. Maybe a regional power, you could argue nowadays, but, you know, in this during this time period, we're sort of a minor power, definitely at the beginning of the game, and we don't necessarily have the capacity to take on the Japanese, the Italians, the Germans, the entirety of the Axis, the fascist powers in the Americas, everything like that at the same time. And so, as a minor country, we are essentially bound to a singular sort of, I don't know, enemy at a time. Maybe a major enemy, that's true. Maybe we can find of a plethora of minor enemies. For example, if you were to play as Romania, which finds itself in sort of a similar position to Australia, and when it comes to, like, not land mass, but maybe resources, eventually you can develop them, and manpower, and industry, everything like that. They're sort of kind of similar, but obviously Romania is surrounded by minor powers it can easily defeat and take over. We don't necessarily have the luxury of something like that as Australia. We have an entire continent to ourselves. However, we are limited when it comes to actual, you know, expansion. So we're gonna have to build tall and get ready for the war against the Japanese. So that's basically the entire strategy. And I have a very interesting strategy. It's going to be something that's not necessarily conventional when it comes to actually, well, just Hearts of Iron 4 in general. If you want to play even as a minor power, it's sort of, you know, sort of required, or sort of expected that you build up quite a formidable army when it comes to actually fighting battles, fighting on the field and everything like that. Now, I won't be going too deep into the Navy, just a little bit, you know, just to boost up the numbers so we can contest in a few regions the Japanese Navy. But ultimately, again, because we're playing a minor British power, a minor power in general, you can't necessarily have too big of a scope when it comes to your overall strategy. You want to limit it a little bit, or, yeah, I mean, I suppose you can have a grand strategy, and you can eventually take over the entire world, and you can fight the entire world, everything like that. It's doable, but that's not necessarily fun. And when you play minor powers, or at least when I play minor powers, I like to experiment here and there about when it comes to, like, strategies which are applicable, which can work, which don't work, which are sort of doable when it comes to the resource base and manpower base that your country has available. everything like that. And so this time it's going to be a very interesting strategy, and I do think that well, it's not one that you see very often when it comes to other countries. That's for sure. Okay, here we go. The Japanese should be at war. Yep, there we go. They're at war with the United States, and we're gonna join that war. Now, obviously, they have taken over the leadership of the faction of the Southwest Pacific Initiative, and even Mexico actually joined that one, which is interesting because they usually join the allies, but I suppose it's the closest thing that they have available to them. Even Panama actually joined that, which is quite interesting, but I do like that. And I've created what is called, or what I would like to call, the Southwest Fortress. The Southwest Pacific Fortress Initiative, in fact. As you can see, I have an absurd number of divisions when it comes to the usual output of Australia, even with this mod, which sort of boosts all the British miners, obviously, to a certain degree. And that is because they are all trashy, or at least most of them are trashy 10-width divisions, focusing on just protecting every single island, or at least a majority of the islands and a majority of the really important islands from the Japanese, because the Japanese really, really, really need those resources to actually put up a decent fight against the United States. They really need those islands for, well, just to bother the allies. They need those islands to cause havoc behind your lines, to really make you focus on your navy, to threaten Australia itself, to threaten the Western powers, to threaten obviously the United States and everything like that. So whenever they start to mess with us, whenever they try to invade, whenever they try to do anything against us, they're gonna hit a big old wall. That's a wall made out of an extreme amount of just crappy 10-width divisions, and hopefully it's gonna work. I mean, you know, they could just punch through, obviously, but even if they do punch through, hopefully they punch through on some like meaningless island, right? Something that, well, it's not meaningless, obviously, because it's basically a naval base for them, but hopefully the resources that they expend on actually punching through on those islands is more than they actually gain from capturing those islands, which is obviously just sort of a war of attrition. It's kind of interesting to have a war of attrition when it comes to the Pacific, because that usually entails island hopping again. So it's something that you don't see a lot when playing just any other country. This is sort of a unique sphere of gameplay when it comes to Hearts of Iron 4, this sort of the South Pacific and the Pacific Islands, essentially here, including the Philippines, obviously. And the Philippines is one of the keys to actually holding this entire region, because the Japanese can really make great use of the Philippines. They can land naval invasions from there into China. They can also use the island of Taiwan, obviously, to do something like that, and they can do a whole bunch of stuff from this entire region. But the Philippines pose a unique threat because the Americans, because it's their puppet, they can essentially grab extra divisions from that landmass, that country, essentially. They can grab more resources. They can use it as a staging area, and so it's quite important for both the Japanese to hold, but also the Americans. And as you can see, they're only trying to do some stuff on New Guinea here, and luckily, because we have so many just crappy divisions, this wall is gonna hold, and that's a beautiful sight to behold indeed. You're gonna hold this initial invasion. The thing about the Japanese is they like to invade basically everywhere. They like to invade everywhere, but they sure do like those resource-heavy areas, and the Philippines especially, it has to be coded somewhere in the AI that they go for it. So the Philippines, more specifically the area around Manila, is extremely heavily defended. Oh, here we go. They're actually punching through here, but that's only a singular division, so hopefully they can hold. I'm not entirely sure if they would be, but there's nothing essentially on that island, so it's the isles seem to be holding quite decently. Not entirely sure. That's a lot of divisions they're just throwing at that one guy. Just one Australian holding like 5 divisions back, you know, with everything. But even if they capture that single island, let's look at the combat. That's a lot of divisions, but those stats should be in our favor. Yeah, we managed to hold them off, even though that was like improbable, so to say. Improbable. Eventually, I think they would have broken through because it's a single division, but obviously that's the disadvantage for the Japanese of having to navally invade. They have to navally invade. They don't have a land connection to us. If they had a land connection, well, we would be able to stagnate the front, I think, a tiny bit. But ultimately, yeah, they didn't succeed. And to a large part, this is thanks to the Chinese, because they're managing obviously to push them back. And I guess it's sort of an unfair test because, well, the Japanese, when they focus on these naval invasions and they're not successful, they really struggle in China. If they manage to actually capture, for example, the Philippines or everything like that, the Dutch East Indies definitely, and Malaya especially, because of all the resources, they tend to just completely annihilate the Chinese. So hopefully we manage to delay them for long enough, and we manage to hold for a decent amount of time, or just long enough for the Chinese to be able to whittle them down. Then maybe island hop to well, to the main islands, to the home isles of Japan itself. And yeah, so that should be interesting. Eventually, I do think we get to take over British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, or protect them, quote unquote, protect them, because we are on the same side of a conflict. And yeah, I do think we should be eventually able to essentially like steal them as a puppet. And it's not, it's not that great because, well, while we do gain a certain access to resources for cheaper, it's not that great because we don't actually gain the cores, and they don't tend to build great divisions which we can steal. And so we're basically just going to throw those divisions and throw all the manpower that the Dutch East Indies and Malaya produce, just all of that into like extra defense, essentially. It's kind of strange that the Japanese are constantly attacking me, but they're not necessarily trying to do anything against the Philippines. They're constantly trying to just attack New Guinea, which is, it's a curious sight to be sure, but well, whatever. So this is the battle plan. This is what we're gonna do for the next, I don't know, 2 hours or something. And we're gonna just sit here and defend and defend and defend, and eventually just island hop. That's the entire strategy, but hopefully it works. I mean, we're managing to, I don't know, cause a bit of an issue for their navy here and there, so they're constantly trying. I mean, they must be expending a whole bunch of resources on this, at least, few guns and time and divisions that could be fighting in China, but they can't be fighting in China because they have to constantly try and invade us. And if those invasions are unsuccessful, they have to try again and again and again. We're tying down at least like maybe 10 to 20 divisions, a whole bunch of naval superiority that they should be using around, I don't know, like British Malaya or the Dutch East Indies or something like that, trying to mount invasions of that. Instead, we are managing to hold them down, and there we go. We can take over the Dutch East Indies. And big ol' lag, but they should become the Australian East Indies, which is quite an... Yeah, I suppose it works. The Australian East Indies, no, the Australian East Indies, and the British obviously hand over the territories because, well, they see that our strategy of whittling down the Japanese is extremely successful, and they're more than eager to hand over those territories to a very friendly Australia. Even though we're independent, we're still on the same side, and those territories are now mightily unprotected. So hopefully the Japanese don't try anything right now. And here we go, we're finally ready to actually do something. Finally ready to launch naval invasion, start the island hopping campaign. And because we're much closer, and we can use the Philippines as a staging base for our invasions, we're much closer, and yeah, it's going to be much more interesting than island hopping through each individual island in the Pacific, which, yeah, that would get extremely tedious. But because we managed to defend for so long and so successfully, we can just do this, and we can start the invasion of Taiwan. And here we go. Yep. Uncontested, which is a bit of a shame. It would have been interesting if it actually turned into kind of a stalemate, where we both try to constantly invade each other and it's unsuccessful. Now that would have been quite the campaign. Eventually, we'd have to deploy the nukes, I suppose, and or just try to overwhelm them with a naval invasion of like 100 divisions. But I'm not entirely sure if that would have been all that well feasible. Might have been easier just to. I don't know. At that point, I don't know what really would have been feasible. But you know, the first island is secured, and we should be working towards the next one. There we go. Just good old school island hopping. That's basically what we're trying to do here. And let's try and actually defend those islands, because if they manage to navally invade us back, that would be a bit of trouble, because, well, that would be an interesting campaign as well, I suppose, if we just constantly steal these islands from each other. It's not necessarily what actually happened in history. Well, to a certain degree, because the Japanese managed to overwhelm. Obviously, during the early years of the war, they managed to overwhelm the defenders, and then the West had to take all of that back and everything like that. But we don't want that sort of situation actually happening right now. And yeah, was actually kind of surprising to a certain degree, but not necessarily surprising at all, is that the Americans haven't really done anything. It's all, you know, we had to defend everything, we had to fight tooth and nail to actually defend these islands, defend our islands. Yeah. So it's these sort of invasions are actually the best when it comes to draining Japanese manpower and resources and everything like that, and, well, supplies and everything, because they constantly try to take you over. But if you're actually well entrenched, you build at least a few, or at least a couple like forts there. Like a naval fort, a single naval fort, and a single land fort usually does the trick when it comes to just holding back these sort of invasions, because you can defend from both kinds of invasions. They don't get your troops, and they don't get the port, because you have a naval port there, a naval fort there, and they don't get your troops either, because they can constantly just bash themselves against your divisions. But because you have a single fort there and they don't have any supplies, and let's say you did boost your defense and everything like that. Maybe you give them like engineer companies or something like that, or you just have a good advisor. Yeah, you're just gonna be fine. You're just gonna be fine, and they're gonna starve themselves till they basically have nothing, and then you just kill them, and you kill off like, I don't know, at least 20 to 30,000 manpower. That's not insignificant. That's definitely not insignificant. It's It's not insignificant when it comes to the actual amount of damage that Australia usually does, right? Because you can, sure, as a major power, like 20 to 30,000, that's basically a single, like, a tile, like on the Eastern Front, basically. But yeah, it's quite significant when it comes to the amount of damage that usually Australia can do when it comes to fighting off, I don't know, like Germany and Africa or something like that. But actually, Britain has a division there. That's the British are even here, but the Americans, they're just nowhere. That is like the American AI in Hearts of Iron 4. It's so focused on Europe, which makes sense. But I mean, the Americans, I don't think they aren't actually at war with the Axis. They do have a whole bunch of volunteers sent over, I think, but no, they're actually not at war with the Axis. So it's it's quite sort of strange. I mean, why aren't they trying to invade? Why aren't they doing anything? Instead, they're having a big old romp through Africa. Now that's wonderful, but yeah, it's time to take over the next island. Alright, here we go. Maybe this time is actually going to be an opposed landing, but I really doubt that because, well, there's no sign of anyone being there, so it's, yeah, there's probably no one there, but, you know, it just helps, you know, it has a certain spirit to it, and if we want to get closer to the Japanese home islands, then, well, we gotta have to take the closest island, that's definitely Okinawa right here, so, let's go for it, and, yep, again, unopposed. But, yeah, kind of a shame. Was kind of hoping that this would be like a grand island strategy with actual like opposed landings and everything like that. Like actually like the Pacific campaign. But it seems like yeah, nothing came. Well, might as well go for Nagasaki then. Well, this is it. 25 divisions invading Japan itself. Now this is going to be an interesting one, not because I'm afraid that the invasion might not work. They sure haven't been really opposing me up until now at all, so that's kind of a no-brainer, and we can just easily invade. They don't actually have their navy here at all, and we're blowing their well, the transports out the water. But what's more threatening is that we only have 25 divisions and we are invading their homeland, and the Japanese can actually pump up quite a big number of divisions. So I'm hoping a majority of them are currently fighting in well, against the Chinese, and we can have sort of a safe romp through the islands of Japan. It's going to be sort of a, you know, sort of a, well, maybe sort of a summer walk. It's not exactly summer in the game either, but well, it's going to be sort of a swift breeze through the through the islands of Japan, and it's going to be, you know, just sort of a cakewalk, and it's really looking like one currently. Sort of a, well, just makes me kind of like wonder like where exactly are the Japanese divisions, because they sure as hell aren't on the Japanese Isles, which is quite an interesting sight to behold for sure. You'd think that they'd have at least some army here. They do have some sort of an army here, but they're not necessarily trying to hold us back that they sort of like meaningful forces, like what, 5 divisions have turned up so far, which is I mean, for one, it's quite worrisome that they didn't have anyone protecting their well, the home islands at all. It's quite worrisome that they didn't pull back the entirety of the or at least a majority of their army back, because we are now currently like taking over their core territory and their industry and everything like that. So I mean, maybe the Japanese just really, really need those islands, and they really need those islands, otherwise the Japanese AI just doesn't know what to do with itself. Because we managed to essentially defend almost against every single invasion, and even the invasions that were successful, they didn't ever capture any ports, and so we managed to just essentially just eliminate them. I mean, those casualties speak for themselves. We haven't really done any fighting up until this point, except just holding each and every single island. So, I mean, maybe those invasions just killed off those divisions. I'm not entirely sure, but I don't really think so. We killed off maybe like 5, 6 to 10 divisions in total. So, yeah, these 25 divisions are actually like conquering like a quarter of the territory at this point. So there's really nothing here from the Japanese. Kind of a worrying sight. But what's even a more worrying sight is that there are no Americans here. This is just all the Australians. This is this is just the Australian mates. The Australian mates just going through and conquering Japan. That was a terrible accent, by the way. But yeah, no one's here. And we're gonna have to do this basically all on our own, and not to like be too harsh on the Americans, because basically no one is here. You'd think that, you know, the Allied AI in Europe, whenever we make a landing, they immediately plow in like every single one of their divisions. The entire British army just suddenly appears whenever you make a landing in Scandinavia or France or Denmark or whatever against the Germans. Because the Japanese, there's no one here. It's just Australia. This is this is just Australia. Gotta hold those ports and everything, though. Not the ports, but the crossings, because you never know when you get cut off, and you definitely need to hold those things. So yeah, we're gonna have to do a few strategical eliminations of possible threats here, and we're gonna have to slowly conquer our way through the islands, because as I say, or the isles, because as I say, this is only like 25 divisions, yeah. So out of the total of over 200 that we have right now, a majority of those, like the overwhelming majority of those, are just like shitty 10-widths holding the isles. But you know, they've done their part. You know, definitely they have been more than useful, more than helpful, and the ultimate strategy actually has worked quite nicely. Oh, there we go. The allies are actually turning up. Nice going. You know, when we've conquered essentially half of the entirety of the Japanese core territory with just 25 divisions. Yeah, now the Allies decide to turn up in a very minor show of force. They let the Australians do everything, and then they turn up. This is Gallipoli all over again, but this time we are leading the charge, and we are actually making decisions for ourselves, and it turns out it's actually going rather nicely indeed. But we are about to win this war, so let's take a look at those. Actually, that's not that much. It's roughly a very, well, not even close, but, well, managed to have quite the KD ratio here. But it's not the usual numbers you see from Japan. Usually you see, you know, the damage being done in the millions. So this is actually quite an interesting sight to behold. We managed to just completely slam the Japanese just by holding the islands. Holding the Pacific Islands, and turns out very good strategy, even though we barely had any good divisions, like 25 actually decent divisions, and those quote-unquote decent divisions were just trash, basically. So on the Eastern Front they would have died basically immediately to the German tanks, but because the Japanese didn't have anything here, and because we whittled them down so heavily through just holding everything, we managed to have a good bit of luck. So well, thanks, Kings, for watching, and see you next time.